Chapter 23, Captain Bowditch commanding. "Come along with me, Nat," Dr. Holyoke suggested. "You might as well help set a leg. 6 months from now, you might be bossing the job." When they turned in at Lem's gate, they could hear him raging. When Lem saw them, he broke out afresh. He'd been mending the shingled roof of their little house when the ladder had slipped sideways. He tangled with it as he'd fallen. "Me!" he stormed. "Me fall off a house! Me that's hung by my eyebrows, reefing sail in a storm. Fix me up good, Doc, so I can be ready when the Putnam sails." "Not a chance of it, Lem. This is a compound fracture." "Now listen, Doc." "Shut up, man. You'd be a nuisance on shipboard." "Oh," Lem was silent. "Then listen, Captain Bowditch. There's a lot I'd better tell you. When you hit the coral reefs off Sumatra," Lem never stopped talking while the leg was set. Nat was glad Polly wasn't there to hear everything he said of Sumatra. November 21st, the Putnam sailed, bound for Sumatra and the Pepper Islands, God willing. Captain Bowditch commanding. Captain Bowditch commanding. Nat looked about his ship and whispered those words to himself. He took his departure from Cape Ann. In his cabin, he marked his chart and started the log of the Putnam. Billy Partel, his cabin boy, entered. "Mr. Denny's compliments, sir. The watches are set." Nat went on deck. Lupe's smile flashed and was reefed. Mr. Sanchez, now second mate of the Putnam. A good man. A good crew, Nat thought. Old Chad Jensen at the wheel. Chad's grandson, young Corey, looked edgy. Probably hadn't found his sea legs yet. Good stuff in the boy. Nat spoke to them quietly. He had good men in charge, he told them, Mr. Denny and Mr. Sanchez. They were to be obeyed at all times. He saw a flicker of bewilderment in the eyes of the crew. "I suppose I should have roared," he told himself, "but I can't think of anything to roar about." He told Mr. Denny and Mr. Sanchez he'd see them below at one bell. When he talked to his mates, he told them again they were in charge. "Unless you need me, of course, but I don't expect you will." They said, "Aye, aye, sir." They went above. Then, for the first time the awful aloneness hit him. He was responsible, finally and completely. All the long, lonely way to the Cape, all the treacherous, squally weeks in the Indian Ocean, he was responsible. No matter what came up, night or day, if it baffled his men, he must decide. For the first time, he began to understand Captain Prince, the set of his jaw and the bite of his words when a voyage began, the eternal alertness that never relaxed. He knew now why Prince always seemed to shed about 10 years when they made their landfall. He thought of his father, his sloop aground on Anguilla Reef. He imagined how it must have been to watch helpless while his future was beaten to pieces. He remembered how Granny had said, "It took the tuck out of him." He remembered the threat of battle off Cadiz when he had pulled off his shoes and had gone to the powder room. He had forgotten where he was, had worked problems on a powder keg. He couldn't forget now. If battle threatened, he couldn't let others make the decisions. If they were challenged now, he must decide. If he'd surrender his ship, if his men would die defending it, if he lost a man, he must answer the faces on the wharf when he returned. Lupe's young bride, Denny's wife, and the 2 boys. Nat shook his head and went topside. He'd have to stop that way of thinking. Not 12 hours from home. He'd be gone 12 months, maybe longer. He was sailing to an uncharted coast in an untried ship. No man knew yet how the Putnam would sail. In the days that followed, the Putnam proved herself with flying colors. She passed the Eliza that had sailed 6 days before the Putnam weighed anchor. The crew of the Putnam shouted and swaggered. A good omen, that. They'd set a record. In February, they stood off Cape Town to fill their water casks and replenish supplies. Then the last familiar land park faded astern. With luck, their next landfall would be Sumatra. Thousands of miles yet to go. The Cape seemed next door to the Indies, till a man had sailed in the Indian Ocean. 10 days from the Cape, Billy came to Nat with wide eyes. "Mr. Denny's compliments, sir. Could you come on deck? Well, something's broken loose." Nat checked the glass. It was falling. He went topside. Mr. Denny said, "Craziest thing I've ever seen, sir. Hardly enough wind to make sternway, and the waves are pounding us to pieces." Nat studied the sky, huge cumulus clouds. Another wave crashed on the deck. "A typhoon, Mr. Denny. The waves always outrun the wind. When the wind rises, we'll be able to make headway. We'll carry sail as long as possible. May outrun the storm." Billy whispered, "How can we, sir? Typhoons move 100 miles an hour, don't they?" "They just go around that fast," Nat told him. "They don't move across the ocean at anything like that speed. You know how it is when you spin a top? It goes around very fast and gradually moves across the floor." "Aye, aye, sir, I know about a top." "Well, a typhoon, they call it a hurricane in the Caribbean, is just like a spinning wine top. A huge top. It may be 10 miles across, maybe 20 miles. Maybe bigger. The air may be whirling around 100 miles an hour, but the wind top moves across the ocean rather slowly, maybe only 8 or 10 miles an hour. So it is possible to outrun one." And if we can't, sir, what then?" Billy's eyes were huge in his pale face. You heave to on a port tack." "Below the equator," Nat told him. "I'll tell you all about it sometime, if you'd like to know." "Yes, sir. Aye, aye, sir. I'd like that fine." The hours passed. 8 bells. The watch was relieved. 8 bells again, and the starboard watch lay below. The clouds were strange shapes now and tinged with copper. The wind freshened. "Mr. Denny, have a lifeline rigged," Nat ordered. "Aye, aye, sir." Men stretched a heavy line the length of the Putnam from bow to stern. More wind. The top hamper creaked. Lupe grinned and shouted, "Long as she creaks, she holds, eh?" The rain began, a thin driving mist. 8 bells again, but no one lay below now. It was all hands on deck. More wind. When Nat finally gave the order to reef sail, the men lay aloft on the double. Huge waves crashed over the Putnam. The rain poured until men ducked their heads in a crooked elbow to breathe. 2 men at the helm now. The Putnam rolled scuppers under. Lupe staggered to keep his footing and shouted in Nat's ear, "Got the worst of it now, eh?" Nat didn't try to answer. He knew this was just the beginning. If they were sucked into the center of the whirling wind top, there wasn't a ghost of a chance. At last the wind lessened. The glass began to rise. The huge waves still pounded them. The torrents of water still poured down, but the worst was over. The typhoon was passing them. It was 2 days later before the skies cleared and Nat could check their position and set his course once more for Sumatra. In early May, they sighted the loom of shadowy mountains off their starboard bow. When they reached the latitude of Susu Bay, they stood off until the sun was behind them. Then Nat sent a man to the foremast to watch the coral reefs and 2 men to the chains to sound. Warily, they inched their way through coral reefs to their anchorage. Other Salem captains were there loading pepper. They asked news of home. Nat told them news as of last November and asked about pepper. They shook their heads. Not much chance for another ship to load at Susu, not for weeks. Nat weighed anchor, beat his way out through the treacherous coral to Pulu Koya. More Salem captains there. They too asked news of home. They too shook their heads over the prospects of another ship loading pepper. Not for many weeks, they said.